Good morning, students. Today I'm going to talk about the process and the way in which the government of India basically adopted the rule-based fiscal policy. So, the Indian economy experienced a macroeconomic and a balance of payment crisis during 1991, which is all of us studied in every possible way. While there are different explanations regarding this crisis, including, for instance, the breakdown of Soviet Union or the crisis in the left bloc, USSR and all, leading by USSR and also fall in flow of remittance as the result of Kuwait war, especially in the Gulf country, the upsurge in the petroleum price, and unarguable immediate cause, in fact, was very much impending as far as the state is concerned. This is what is, in fact, the baseline of the crisis. That is the unsustainable fiscal deficit of the preceding year, which is actually 1991. So there are many problems being cited, especially if you read N.K. Singh's report in 2017. He was basically figuring out all these things, and in the aftermath of 1991 crisis, India adopted a comprehensive economic reform program. As we indicated, to a large extent, the external payment crisis of 1991 was an inevitable consequence of the deteriorating fiscal situation during 1980s. So this was an opinion which is, it is the study of Misra and other scholars in the field in 2008. Hence, one of the most essential component of this program, therefore, was fiscal reform. So this is what is actually categorically all of them were being mooted, and they said that now the crisis is here and let's have a reform. That reform is in fact an adjustment which is called the structural adjustment. So you are trying to have a reform which is in fact fundamentally changes the very structure of Indian economy and its production as well as its external relationship. So therefore, fiscal adjustment constitute a major plank of that policy response. So fiscal management literature in India has been providing increasing attention to the poor fiscal performance of the center and the state and its impact on macroeconomic stability. For example, the works of Ahilwalia, Rao, many people, Chellaya, Govinda Rao, so many people, especially the people from NIPFP and Decreer and all the deleting tanks were being talked about all this thing. So hence, containing fiscal deficit with the objective of macroeconomic stability had been given utmost priority. During 1991, the combined fiscal deficit, therefore, of the center and the state had exceeded, grew at a very rapid rate, especially it was exceeded 10% of the GDP. As in the earlier lecture, I have already pointed out that, even budgetary deficit, this is something to do with the budget deficit, okay? So the budgetary deficit. But the problem is that there are other means, in fact, is playing a very crucial role as far as the debt of the states are concerned, fiscal deficit of the states are concerned. So the large component now going to constitute from the outside borrowing or out of budget borrowing in that sense. So things are not going to be that simple as we think. However, in 1990s, in the later half of, in the early 1990s, the combined fiscal deficit of the center and state was more than 10% of the GDP, and the stabilization measures launched in the initial phase of the reform helped to bring down the combined fiscal deficit significantly to less than 7%. But the improvement was short-lived. The deficit started moving up again since 97, 98, reached again around the 10% mark in 1999, 2000. So again, people said that, so again, it is actually going up. Now, interestingly, this is also a part of time where the international or the world economy, especially the East Asian crisis. This is in the post East Asian crisis, as well as in India. You have a lot of swing in the political front, especially there is a lot of an instability in the central government. So many actually so many factors played this change, and international market fluctuations during the period is in fact constituted a major portion in this case. So this time a good part of the deficit originated from the state budget, accounting for almost one half of the combined deficit, that is half in fact, which was not the case earlier. Now again, this is also we need to be not understood in terms of a simple quantity, because now this is the period, because of the post reform period, the sort of a burden, especially the responsibility of the state, especially in the post Panchayati Raj and all case, the spending pattern had an enormous shift which was never been taught. So again, we should be a little bit cautious about all this thing. And the significant, maybe you by quantity wise you say that okay, the centers basically the state's deficit is increasing, but the state's deficit is also part of the other legislations which is all of us made. And the significant share of the state's deficit in the combined fiscal deficit necessitated the need for fiscal adjustment at the state levels. People were said that okay, because the quantity had increased, then but at the same time your responsibility also increased. Why I said this is very important, because now in the post we are talking about the 15th Finance Commission. I will be having a discussion on that in a separate lecture, but still as a point of an anecdote we have to mention this. So in the 15th Finance Commission, the state's responsibility in spending, especially in the social sector and other sector, has increased when you compared with the earlier one. So naturally your spending, your deficit portion is also going to be expected to increase, or it is going to be increased. So I don't think that if some people would say that okay, let's have a reforms in the post 2020 or 2025, it's possible. And why this is possible? Because you are already preceding a commission which is basically a constitutional body, which is in fact mandates so that you have to have this sort of a spending, and they're going to merge the centrally sponsored scheme. That means the center is going to cut down its spending, whatever number of projects, etc., and they're shifting it simply to the state and giving a share. And now you fully spend and you give partially this share and ask the state to spend. Definitely this spending is mandatory to the state now, and the states are more responsible because they are in a decentralized subnational level. So people have more say on them, and for obvious reasons they have to spend, and then the deficit will increase in that sense. Naturally, this is in that sense going to have a sort of a planning to have a more reforms in that sense. So this is what is I have this hunch. Simply speaking, that the quantity had increased unless and until you understand the situation, the things are not going to be as simple as we think. So this is a policy which is a government policy, which is also people's policy in that sense. So you cannot simply understand things only in terms of quantity. So other aspects also has to be the policy change, macroeconomic variables change, it has to be taken care of. However, given this, whatever the things in 1990, as I said, there are so many reasons behind 1997 between the period of 1997 to 2000, the deficit of the state had mounted up, and fiscal adjustment at the state level in India to stabilize the country's fiscal action is also a concern. Now, though the state have been facing a severe fiscal stress on finances since the mid-80s, the fiscal performance of the state worsened during the 90s. This necessitated the need for a state-level fiscal adjustment, and it becomes an important way out for achieving overall fiscal stability and consequence macroeconomic stability. So in a country like India with multiple development pressures, the approach to the fiscal policy has reformed over a time or a period of time. So now if you see that the combined deficit, definitely the combined deficit has gone up to the point of 2000, and then it is because of the strict policy it was going down. Now, this were actually moved a bit down, especially to the point of 2007-8. Now, why 2007-8? Immediately there is a jerk in the spending because of the world economic crisis. We know that the government has to spend now. Because of that spending, the country resisted at least for a while from slipping into a deep recession in a very earlier stage. However, when the government again started cutting its spending, the economy in fact had slowly moved towards a sort of a stagnation. And we know that if you see the growth pattern of the state in the growth pattern of India and many states, the trend is very interesting. That now with the I would like to argue that if your fiscal spending is falling like at a rate of from 8 to maybe 6% or less than that, the growth is also slipping in that sense. There is also a slipping of the growth which is taking place, or the overall GDP growth has been also the rate at which the GDP increase has also been falling, because the spending from the other side is actually falling. So somebody can actually come and say that if the fiscal deficit, that is, if the fiscal deficit goes down, definitely the economic growth can also come down, because the spending part is actually being missing, because the autonomous spending is now act in fact as a very oiling or kind of a greasing rule as far as the country like India is concerned, because you don't have a very nice developmental infrastructure development, health and education, etc. All the social sector is actually not very good. So given all this fact, if you reduce your spending, any graph if you plot, I can simply say that there is a positive correlation between the reduction in the fiscal deficit as well as the reduction in, because it's quite obvious from if anybody check with the combined fiscal deficit of the state and center, as well as the slipping down of the growth of the GDP growth or per capita GDP growth rate at which the GDP growth increases can also be seen in a similar direction. So can we say that actually if the simply from a very layman's point of view, or a simple economic understanding, if one can immediately draw a conclusion that if the fiscal deficit goes down, then definitely the growth also goes down. So this is easily possible. And any if you data, if you collect data and run a regression or even a correlation matrix, you will get the same result which I said, and it is cogent in fact in that context. So what I feel is that again the state deficit is more or less stabilized. Again, why? Because the state spending is almost stabilized. Most of the state is also having a sort of a stabilization, but at the same time the center spending, the fiscal deficit ratio, that is GFD, gross fiscal deficit, is actually quite drastically fallen, which is having a positive effect in that sense from the center's point of view, the growth. Because now if you spend less, then naturally there is a correlation between your spending with that of the decreased growth rate which is the country following. See, the Keynesians of the country and the people who are arguing for creating an effective demand in the economy, all of them argue for this particular point. This is in fact true, and I can establish a correlation between these two things. And even if you have a cause and effect understanding, things are going to be in the same direction. So it is very important to understand that whether we are really talking about this particular aspect. Now when people are very much interested in the Indian context is concerned about the fiscal reform, let us discuss about fiscal reforms. Now, all the reforms were initiated at the beginning of the 90s. It picked up in second half of the 90s when the state level fiscal crisis set in. Now, the state have initiated several measures towards fiscal consolidation, covering revenue augmentation, expenditure containment, public sector restructuring, and institutional reforms. Okay, and in order to strengthen the over revenue side, state have undertaken measures towards enhancement rationalization of various taxes such as land revenue, motor vehicle tax, entertainment tax, sales tax, electricity duty, professional tax, and luxury tax. A notable tax reforms during this period was the VAT, the value added tax, at the state level, with the objective of avoiding the cascading nature of the sales tax and tax competition. Therefore, which is actually meant to bring in transparency also to the system of tax administration and converging the multiple rates and taxes into a few rates and a single VAT. So this is what is actually the very heart of the reforms which was initiated in the post FRBM, or what I said, the fiscal reform, especially in 2004, 5 and 5, 6. Now, another more recent tax reforms adopted in India is the introduction of GST, which all of us, it is in place from 2017 onwards, July 1st, 2017. And introduction of GST has resulted in uncertainty of revenue mobilization in short run due to implementation glitch, which is very quite obvious, because your GSTN, that is your network, is not intact, then definitely you will have a problem with the payment, repayment, especially the tax payment. And this is what is the glitches largely being pointed out, and now we are slowly having a sort of resolution in this case, and we are slowly getting better. And therefore the center has agreed to compensate the state incurring losses in revenue due to GST. Now, many times what we see, especially in the recent times, at least a couple of times, to the state like Kerala, the center has in fact denied. Of course, they have given money, but it is being delayed. So if you delay, then it will create crisis for the state. So there is a lot of issues as far as the subnational level, as far as the subnational levels are concerned, as well as now, given that the power of the center and the transitory problem with the GST and all, the state is going to suffer more than actually the center. Obviously, in the long term, maybe we will all enjoy a very good thing. But as far as the state's autonomy is concerned, the GST is trying to basically make a point that the taxable power is no longer flexible with the states. And in fact, I would argue, or even keep going to the autonomy or the federal right of the states imposing tax being now curtailed due to the GST. And in that sense, the autonomy of the states is also being curtailed. This is what is actually the effect of the GST. So the state have also undertaken several measures to enhance non-tax revenue in that context. So these include revision of tuition fee, medical fees, irrigation, water rates, and tariff on urban water supply. On the expenditure front, a number of many states are actually now looking for user fees. This is quite possible because what I see that because of the center which is having imposed on the GST and having no flexibility of the state getting revenue outside this particular, so because it is now uniformed and they cannot charge any more taxes in that sense. So what is actually now going to happen is a fees raj is going to be taking place. Now everything can be having user charge. So maybe now depending on the welfareistic concerns of the state, now this is going to vary. because there are states maybe charging very high user fee but supplies poor quality services, but at the same time some state may feel opposition or may face opposition from having even a nominal fees, though the quality of services may be better. So all these issues are going to take place, and because this is all the results of the post GST scenario, which is now almost all the states are undergoing, and the discussion is going on. Especially if you take in the case of Kerala, now your development expenditure is too much. I'm not saying that it is too much, but it is sufficiently good. I would say sufficiently, but your revenue is not that sufficiently good. So this is the problem. So when you have a revenue crunch, especially the state like Kerala's ambition is to provide a world-class or a Scandinavian or a Nordic country standard health facility or a socialist status to its citizens. So all the government, especially the current government, is committed to basically provide this sort of a high class health facility as well as the education facility for common people, and they are committed to it. Now once you committed to this particular objective, then what is actually your point? You don't have an income base, because now it is with the GST. If it is with the GST, then the state government may not be having a sort of flexibility in creating. So where do you find? You have to go for the cess, or you have to go for user fee, you have to go for, then people will immediately start saying, oh, fees and other things are actually neoliberal. This is neoliberal policy by its very setup, which makes the states less less flexible to have a spending through their budget and through their income expenditure policy. You can't actually now have tax because GST is, so the indirect possibility of an indirect tax is already being standardized or neutralized. So the income of the state is going to be missing from that part. Now remember that the country like India or Kerala particularly is not different from India, because you have to follow the center as well as the same legislation. Now the state like Kerala, you or the center, our tax base is the majority of the tax or income comes from the indirect tax, whereas the Nordic country, which I said, their income comes from the personal income tax, which is personal income tax of that direct taxes around 40% to 50% in all those countries. And now whatever good facility which they can give, because they can give because 50% of the or 40% of the income which is generated by its people is directly paid to the exchequer back. And at the same time, the indirect tax also exists, but the proportion would be lesser. Now, India, you have actually this regressive indirect tax, which is having a high effect, whereas you have a less than 10 to 12% average kind of a, or 15. You put it as an optimistic larger amount, which is 15%, 1.5. So that amount is insufficient to give a world-class standard. So as I was suspecting, the government will go for fee-raj, or they have to basically incorporate now fees or their services, now government services. Even if you give a quality survey, people don't mind to basically pay. So now the government is in fact I expect that they will be introducing a fee in the near future because of this inflexibility in the GST, the tax regime. So this is a very, very important point as far as the tax reforms are concerned. So the importance of fiscal consolidation is also evident from the terms of reference to the Finance Commission. So as I said, in the 15th Finance Commission's case, so in the this is actually started much earlier, that the 11th Finance Commission was asked to review the state's finances of the center and state, and to recommend the restructuring plan to restore fiscal balance and maintain macroeconomic stability. Now, in the 12th five-year plan, like its predecessors, has advanced a plan for restructuring public finances for restoring budgetary balance, achieving macroeconomic stability and a debt reduction along with equitable growth. Now, in the 11th and 12th Finance Commissions, where have suggested a uniform fiscal restructuring path for the states. Now, based on that only, we are actually moving. And the 12th Fiscal Finance Commission had developed state-level fiscal adjustment scenario based on the set of macro assumption. It assumed that the combined fiscal deficit would be reduced to 6% of the GDP, and revenue deficit would be reduced to zero. So there is no revenue deficit, and of course you have a fiscal deficit which has to be 6%, which would enable an increase in the aggregate saving rate as well as the capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Now, now there is an important question: if you do have a sort of a saving, but you don't have a spending on the other side, and things are not going to be that good. I'll come to that point a little later. And as a consequence of this, aggregate investment would increase, and the real now aggregate investment of whom would increase, and the real growth would stabilize at above 7%. This is what is actually the perspective of different economists. However, this exercise is totally devoid of any cost benefit calculus. This is what is the point which was placed by Maharikshat and people, and this is a very, very important aspect as far as the, what is actually the baseline of such spending. If this is all technical as well as theoretical, conceptual level exercise, not in a ground reality, because who is actually going to invest? Now, as I said, you take the health sector, the health boom is being basically funded by the state in different aspect. Now, if you say that just cut it and things are going to be not very good, and the education, all kinds of these activities are having its own effect, and but this Finance Commission is actually talking something different. So the 12th Finance Commission also put forward a scheme of debt consolidation and a debt relief scheme for the state. The benefit of this scheme, however, is conditional on the states enacting fiscal responsibility legislation. Now, on the line of the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act is the culmination of all these reforms. So the Finance Commission basically gave way to the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, and in an effort to renew the process of the fiscal consolidation and provide for a long-term macroeconomic stability, central government enacted this act in August 2003. At the state level, many of the state government enacted a similar legislation or fiscal responsibility with the objective of ensuring fiscal stability, intergenerational equity, and financial stability, etc. So, with these goals in view, the fiscal responsibility legislation laid down a time-bound program to eliminate revenue deficit and bring down the fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP of 2008-9, which was actually completely scuttled because of the global crisis. No, this is very important because the world is not actually crisis-free or uncertainty-free. So you have always a risk, and you say that only 3%. Now, given even I doubt that the United States is actually subscribed to this view. Even most of the European Union subscribes to the 3%, but they are saying that okay, if you have a debt which is actually the rate of growth of the debt is which is greater than the rate of growth of your GDP, then you should not actually borrow. That is a fine. This is what the dormer condition largely speaks. So that is fine with it. But if you have a very high growth rate and you are saying that you spend less, definitely you have a recession, which I was mentioned earlier. That in real terms, things are actually happening in that sense and working in that sense. So there have been several instances of the FRBM goals being rest. Therefore, we need to really, But the most important deviation of FRBM had happened in the year 2009, 8-9, in the wake of the global financial crisis. As I said, the crisis is the most important aspect of life. Then if you say that, of course we should have rule, and there is a possibility of deviation from there also, which has actually been proven in this particular case. And the global financial crisis slowdown in domestic growth and counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus caused a temporary pause in the fiscal consolidation. And in fact, this is not temporary. Now, again, as far as the growth of the state is, the total, the combined state as well as the center is concerned, now it is having a slow dip in the last 6 years. Ever since 2014 till now, actually the production now in now at this point, that is in 2020, we are in the midst of a pandemic, global pandemic, which is in fact skews, and the expected outcome of the GDP growth is basically at least less than a 20 to 25% less than what is in the last year. So this is actually good, having negative growth and shrinking in the economy, and definitely who is going to be responsible in this sort of a growth crunch. So what a crisis. Now this definitely the government has to spend. Now the central government had said 20,000 crores, sorry, 2 lakhs crore, 20 lakhs crore program, but nothing happened. 20,000 crore from Kerala. Now they are trying to basically mobilize fund, and partially they were started. But the central government is still in the pipeline. Of course, I am an optimist. I believe that the government is going to spend, because the government has commitment towards its citizens and people. Indeed, the whole economy is depending on that. Then if the government do that, then definitely either they have to do through a budgetary deficit or through an off-budget borrowing. Now if the off-budget borrowing is there, then the center and the state is doing the same thing, because they don't want to actually change the rule. But that is again have another sort of an effect in the long run. However, I'm not going to the details of it. But despite that, the government can't actually completely go in that direction, that the off-budget borrowing is the only mechanism of fund raising. But then the government has to go for the budgetary deficit also. So in the near future, the budgetary deficit is going to be high in that sense, which will again have a spike in this case. So 3% or 4% is literally not going to happen. And now in the recent D2C shows that this is not the case. And the fiscal consolidation path of the central government entails a decline in the revenue deficit for 4.8% of GDP as projected for the year 2019 to a revenue surplus of 0.5% of GDP by 14-15. For the state, the target for the fiscal deficit 2.4% of GDP, and 2014-15, this is the other. But nothing, everything being curtailed, or it is been basically scuttled. So I don't think that things are not things are as lucrative as it is, but possibly things are not very nice in this regard. So the 14th Finance Commission, that instance clearly suggests a larger correction for the center than the state as a whole. So as per the commission, the correction path is primarily to ensure fiscal discipline for the union government. Okay, now the 14th Finance Commission given a specific thrust in this line, and given its large deficit and debt above FRBM target should be curtailed. Now as part of it, very interestingly, I found out that the center is now actually shifting its centrally sponsored schemes and others to the state, and partially funding for through the state. And this is a very tricky way of doing all this, because as I said in the beginning or in the previous lectures, the government cannot reduce the administrative expenditure, which is actually increasing like anything. So in terms of the roadmap, the debt shock was to decline from 43.6% in the 14th Finance Commission, that is in 15-16, to 36.3% GDP in 2019-20, and revenue deficit from 2.56% to 0.93% of GDP for union government. For the state, under the fiscal roadmap drawn, the aggregate fiscal deficit of the state was to change from 2.76% of the GDP in 2015-16 to 2.74% of the GDP in 2019-20. States that GDP ratio would increase marginally in this, that is 21.9% in 15-16 to 22 point. This is not a marginal increase, but again it is going to increase in the next year, coming year. So the consolidated fiscal deficit would decline. That is what is actually the expectation. That is 6.4% in 2015-16 to 5.7% in 2019-20, and the total consolidated outstanding debt would decline in 64.5% to 58.2% in 2009. Now, one of a fellow friend, had in fact done a PhD on this thing, and what is Anish's finding is quite interesting. That is actually the deficit was in fact being diverted, in different forms, and if you consolidate all the deficit which the government partially being supported, then this amount is going to be very higher than what is actually the statistics show. So interestingly, these are the fact as far as the state's deficit managements are concerned. So to achieve the target of GDP ratio of 40% at the center, the committee recommended an accelerated consolidation. Not that actually. What I would like to say now is the new target framework was adopted in 2018-19, which rests on the twin pillar of the reducing debt and fiscal deficit. The FRBM Review Committee, chaired by N.K. Singh, set up in 2016, proposed a draft debt management fiscal responsibility in 2017. This is we have already referred to, replace the Fiscal Responsibility in Budget Management Act of 2003. Now, what is the committee recommended a move to public debt to GDP ratio as a medium-term anchor for fiscal policy in India, as against the current framework where fiscal policy is specified, and the fiscal deficit itself is used as a medium-term target of fiscal policy. And this seems to be a little progressive, and unlike the debt target sets by the 14th Finance Commission, a debt to GDP ratio of 60% should be targeted with a 40% limit for the center and 20% limit for the state for the to be achieved in 2020 to 23. So now, given that all half of the period has been now passed, now our GDP, the state GSDP is actually between 22.4 or 22.5 in the current system. I think even it is a bit more than that. Then the targeting is not yet realized. Now, given the current crisis situation or fiscal contraction, things are going to be slightly different. I think it is going to increase. So to achieve the target debt to GDP ratio of 40% at the center, the committee recommended an acceleration consolidation path where the fiscal deficit should be reduced to 2.5% 2020. Okay. Now again, the committee also recommended that the central government reduces its revenue deficit to GDP ratio steadily by roughly 0.25% point each year to reach 0.8% in 2020-23, 22-23 period. For the state, the recommendation reduction in fiscal deficit GDP ratio is from 3 to 2% of GDP by the year 2020-23, and further down to 1.7, which is completely nonsense, as I said in the earlier. The committee also recommended that the 15th Finance Commission should be asked to recommend the debt trajectory for individual states. So this should be based on their track record of fiscal prudence and health. Now, as I said, what does we really want to have for prudence? Now, if you have a development which is actually surpassing to that of the other state, what is the prudence which we are really talking about? It's completely actually not substantiating by the empirics or the reality, ground reality, which I was worried about. Or the finance bill in 2018, for example, while partially adopting the recommendation of FRBM Review Committee in terms of the public debt target, has not only pushed the time path to 24-25. Now to 22-23 has gone. Now again we are going to actually push further, because it's not that easy to actually target things like this, because of the state and the nature of the state. It's very, very important. Why? It is not because they don't like to. It is difficult to have it, because I'm not saying that because of the condition demands certain things, a base minimum. And these conservatives in fact always act against these principles. Especially, unfortunately, the conservatism is not actually going to help. It is but I'm not saying that you have to be having no rule, or definitely you have to have a rule, but that rule has to give you not specific point but a range. You have to give a sort of a flexibility where you can borrow. Now, that can actually again based on your performance, your kind of the development indicators, not simply because you have this much of population that is not going to work. In fact, the kind of work, the kind of indices develop. Now, in the last couple of years, for health parameters, the education parameter, the Kerala state is coming in the front. Now, if you say that you cut it, then things are not going to work. At the same time, the state is cutting, but they are not coming up. Are they very good? As I said, is actually the development indicators of Orissa or Bihar or Madhya Pradesh or West Bengal is far ahead of than Kerala, and because of their prudent doesn't mean that they're good in that sense. In Kerala, you have a reverse point also. So I think we should have a flexibility, especially when you have a diverse state. State has a diverse experience regarding the development. You cannot actually penalize somebody based on the diversity. So I think when we make rules, state specific rules also, or flexibility in rules regarding the state is also necessitates in this particular context. With this, I think I'll stop today, and I am hoping that this lecture is actually worth listening. Thank you so much for listening it.